Welcome back to GiantMonsterGames. Today, we're going to be doing a modern budget deck tech. The deck we're building today is Soul Sisters, and we are spending $47. At the end of this video, I'll be doing a super budget version and an upgraded version in case you have more or less money to spend on this deck. Let's get started, starting with creatures. To kick things off, we have 4 copies of Soul Warden and 3 copies of Soul's Attendant. These two lovely ladies are the reason this deck is called Soul Sisters. Whenever another creature enters the battlefield, you're going to be gaining 1 life, and we're going to use this life to buffer ourselves into the late game and trigger some special effects. 2 copies of Suture Priest, which we're going to be using to also gain life, because they do a similar effect to Soul Sisters. Also, whenever your opponent plays a creature, they're going to lose a life. It can help make the difference between winning the game and losing the game, because this deck doesn't have a lot of stopping power until we get to the late game. 4 copies of Squadron Hawk. When Squadron Hawk enters the battlefield, you get to search your library for 3 other copies of Squadron Hawk, filling your hand up and giving you lots of creatures to play. Also, this deck largely wins on the back of flying creatures, so this helps a lot. 4 copies of Doomed Traveler. Here's a card that has tons of synergies with this deck. We can use it to chump block, and then we get a 1/1 Flying Spirit, triggering our Soul Sisters, and then also giving us a flying creature, which, as I said before, helps us win the game. 4 copies of a Johnny's Pridemate. This is our main win condition. Every single time that you gain life, a Johnny's Pridemate gets a 1/1 counter on it. This becomes very big, very fast. Something to make note of, the Soul Sisters trigger when a creature enters the battlefield, which means a Johnny's Pridemate also triggers and gives himself a 1/1 counter, if you gained life from him entering the battlefield. And the last creature we have is Sun Titan. This is a money card in the deck, but it is also a fantastic way to close out the game. Whenever Sun Titan enters the battlefield or attacks, you get to pull a creature with converted mana cost 3 or less from your graveyard onto the battlefield. Also, it's a 6/6 with Vigilance, so your opponent can have fun dealing with that. Moving on to spells, we are running 4 copies of Spectral Procession, which gives us 3 1/1 Flying Spirit tokens. As you can guess, also triggers Soul Sisters, and if you happen to have a Johnny's Pridemate on the battlefield at the same time, you're going to put 3 1/1 counters on him. 4 copies of Honor the Pure, which, because all of our creatures are white, make them all bigger. Especially our flying creatures, which, as I said before, they're generally what's going to win us the game. 2 copies of Proclamation of Rebirth. This is also a money card, but it is a total ringer in this deck, because things are going to get killed, we're going to chump a block here and there, and then we're going to use this card to bring 3 creatures with converted mana cost 1 out of our graveyard onto the battlefield. Hello, Soul Sisters. Oh, hello, Doomed Traveler. Bringing them all back. A single copy of Return to the Ranks. This is doing similar to what Proclamation of Rebirth is doing, except it's going to be grabbing anything with converted mana cost 2 or less. And we have to pay for the number of creatures we want to pull out of our graveyard. Now these 2 cards is what makes this Soul Sisters deck a lot different than most other budget decks I've seen out there, because we're going to do some recursion out of our graveyard, which makes this deck go long and really hard to beat. We have 2 copies of Banishing Light, so getting rid of permanents your opponent plays that you don't want on the table, such as Planeswalkers or creatures that are actually going to be a threat. A single copy of Status Snare, which is a flash version of Banishing Light, except for it only targets creatures. 1 copy of Condemn, removing creatures as they attack. And lastly, 2 copies of Nora's Annex. This is also a huge money card in the deck, so let me explain why it's in the deck. In Modern, most decks rely on getting 4 or 5 mana onto the table to run their entire deck. That's all they really need. So if you make it so they have to either spend mana or pay life just to attack you, it's going to eat up their tempo and slow them down significantly. And to round everything out, let's do our mana base. We have 3 copies of Ghost Quarters, which for 1, really help with manlands, which are something we generally have a hard time with, and 2, it's our only real way of slowing down Tron, which tends to be a pretty bad matchup for us. And the rest of our mana base is just plains. 18 plains. Moving on to our sideboard, I'm just going to quickly fire off all these cards for you. 3 copies of Celestial Flare, 2 copies of Celestial Purge, 1 Holy Day, 2 Kami of the False Hope, 1 Planar Outburst, 2 Reflection Trap, and 4 Revoke Existence. That concludes the entire deck. As you can see, it's not super budget, but it's also not terribly expensive either. It's really hard to make a budget Modern deck that you can actually take to a Monday Night Modern or an F&M Modern night and win some matches consistently. This deck manages to do that quite well. With that, let's talk about a couple lines of play here. Don't be scared to chump block with your creatures. Trade up your Squadron Hawks, trade up your Doomed Travelers, let them go to the graveyard, it's okay. You want to try and keep your Soul Warden and your Soul Ascendant on the battlefield as long as possible, because they're going to generate you enough life to get you into the late game. That is largely your objective. Get to the late game so then you can pull your stuff out of your graveyard. Ideally, once you pull your stuff out of the graveyard, you'll have a couple Honor the Pures on the table, and then they're going to come in as 2/2s or 3/3s, or if you're really lucky, 4/4s, and it's going to be really hard to stop your creatures now that they're no longer little 1/1 creatures. And again, we're using Nora's Annex and our other defensive spells just to stave off until we can get to the late game. Okay, let's move into the super budget version of this deck. We're going to take out all the cards that are worth some serious money. Take out the Proclamation of Rebirth, take out Sun Titan, Nora's Annex, Ghost Quarters, Soul's Attendant, Status Snare, and have no sideboard. To make up these lost cards, we're going to be putting in 2 more Banishing Lights, 2 more Condemns, 3 more Return to Ranks, 2 Suture Priests, and 3 Plains. This will bring this deck down to $25. Now keep in mind, this super budget version of this deck doesn't have as good a Soul Sisters synergy, and it has pretty poor graveyard recursion, because the only thing you have going for you is Return to Ranks, and that can cost upwards of 4, 5, 6 mana just to get a healthy amount of creatures out of your graveyard onto the table. But it should still play pretty well. And the absolute last thing we're going to do before we wrap up this video is talk about how do we upgrade this deck. What cards do we want to add in to make this deck more powerful? The first thing we can do is add in another Soul's Attendant and take out our Suture Priests. We don't really need the Suture Priests if we have 4 and 4. We can add in Ranger of Eos, which is actually an extremely popular card in the non-budget version of this deck. He allows us to go and fetch from our library 2 1-cost creatures. Running a 3rd or 4th copy of Proclamation of Rebirth is always a good idea as well. Replacing most of our defensive spells with Path to Exile is a fantastic idea. And lastly, for the main deck, replacing Nora's Annex with Ghostly Prison can really slow down your opponent, seeing as how they have to pay 2 mana just to attack. For the sideboard, I'd find ways of slotting in 2 Stony Silences, 2 Surgical Extractions, and 2 Wrath of Gods. Those will help you with most of the matchups that we have a hard time with. And that concludes our budget deck tech for Soul Sisters. There are links below this video for all 3 of the decks we talked about, the regular budget version, the super budget version, and the upgraded version. Feel free to build these decks and let me know what you think. Also, in the comment section below, tell me what kind of videos you want me to be working on next. More altar videos? More budget modern deck techs? Just regular modern deck techs, I can do those too. I want to hear from you. And also, don't forget to thumbs this video up and subscribe if you like this content. And while you're here, take a look at some of the other videos I've done in the past. And until next time, don't forget to game like a giant monster.